The metallic screech of pulleys echoes through Whitehall Palace as servants strain to hoist 28 stone of rotting royal flesh from bed to chair, their faces turned away from the putrid stench. Quick favor, comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. By late 1546, the most feared monarch in Europe had become a prisoner in his own decaying body. What had once been the golden prince of Renaissance England now lay trapped within walls that reeked of death, attended by men who dared not speak the truth that hung heavy in the winter air. Their king was dying. The transformation had been as dramatic as it was grotesque. Henry's 52-inch waist required specially constructed chairs fitted with mechanical hoists, their wooden frames groaning under the immense weight they were never designed to bear. Court records from this period reveal the extraordinary measures needed just to move the monarch from his private apartments to the presence chamber. Teams of 6 men worked in coordinated shifts, their muscles straining against rope and pulley systems that had become as essential to royal protocol as the crown jewels themselves. The king's legs told their own horrific story. 11 years had passed since that fateful jousting accident in January 1536, when Henry's horse had crashed down upon him, bursting the varicose ulcers that would never truly heal. What had begun as sporting injuries had festered into suppurating wounds that physicians cauterized with red-hot irons, filling the royal chambers with the sickening smell of burning flesh. The Spanish ambassador, a man accustomed to the refined courts of Europe, reported with barely concealed disgust that Henry's ulcers could be detected 3 rooms away, their putrid odor announcing the monarch's approach long before his mechanical chair rounded the corner. But why had England's physicians, the finest medical minds money could command, proven so utterly helpless against their sovereign's decline? The answer lay not just in the primitive state of Tudor medicine, but in a far more sinister reality. By law, no doctor dared predict the king's death. To suggest that Henry VIII might not recover was tantamount to treason, punishable by the same axe that had claimed so many necks during his reign. And so they applied their useless remedies, herbal concoctions, bloodletting prayers, while privately knowing their patient was beyond salvation. The political implications of Henry's condition created a web of conspiracy that extended throughout the highest levels of government. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to 9-year-old Prince Edward, watched the king's decline with calculating eyes. Every labored breath, every fever-induced delirium, every moment of unconsciousness was noted and assessed for its strategic value. The Protestant faction, long overshadowed by conservative Catholics like the Duke of Norfolk, sensed their moment approaching. But timing would be everything. Henry's apartments in Westminster had become a macabre theatre where the greatest performance was the pretense that recovery remained possible. Aromatics burned continuously to mask the stench of infection, their sweet smoke creating an almost ceremonial atmosphere around the dying monarch. Courtiers who had once competed for the privilege of royal audience now found themselves reluctant participants in an elaborate charade, their carefully composed expressions hiding the revulsion that threatened to overcome them in the king's presence. The mechanical apparatus required for Henry's daily existence had transformed the very nature of monarchy itself. Where once the king had commanded through physical presence, his imposing height, his athletic grace, his ability to dominate any room he entered, now he ruled from a prison of infected flesh. The chair hoists and wheeled contraptions that moved his enormous bulk had become symbols of power's limitations, physical manifestations of how even absolute authority could be reduced to helpless dependency. Yet perhaps most disturbing was what the king's condition revealed about the nature of royal power itself. Henry had spent decades reshaping England according to his will, breaking with Rome, dissolving monasteries, executing queens and nobles with ruthless efficiency. He had made himself supreme head of the English Church, answerable to no earthly authority. But now, confined to his reeking chambers, he faced an enemy that cared nothing for royal prerogative, his own dying body. The winter of 1546 brought with it a crescendo of symptoms that even the most optimistic courtiers could no longer ignore. Recurring fevers left Henry delirious for hours at a time, his massive frame shaking with chills that no amount of firewood could warm. Dropsy had begun to swell his already enormous body, while his complexion took on the waxy yellow hue that attendants had learned to associate with the king's worst episodes. His physicians, walking the knife's edge between medical duty and political survival, continued their futile treatments while privately preparing for the inevitable. As December's short days gave way to the longest nights, a question hung unspoken in every shadowed corner of Whitehall Palace. How much longer could the Lion of England continue to draw breath? The answer would determine not just the fate of a dynasty, but the future of English religion, politics, and power itself. But what Henry's court could not yet know was that their king had already begun the final preparations for his own death, and the deadly game of succession was about to begin in earnest. On December 30th, the dry stamp presses into warm wax with a decisive thud, sealing Henry's final will as his trembling hand can no longer grip a pen. This document would determine the fate of 3 future monarchs and reshape English power for generations. But first, it had to survive the deadly political chess game already unfolding in Whitehall's shadowed corridors. The revised will represented Henry's most calculated political maneuver, even as his body surrendered to decay. 16 executors were named to govern during Edward's minority, a carefully balanced council designed to prevent any single faction from seizing absolute control. But the king's strategic thinking, once sharp enough to outmaneuver popes and emperors, now functioned through a haze of pain and opium-induced confusion. The Protestant reformers, led by Edward Seymour, had positioned themselves with ruthless precision to exploit every moment of the king's diminished capacity. The dry stamp itself had become a symbol of Henry's deteriorating condition. Where once his bold signature had commanded fleets and condemned queens, now a mechanical device pressed his royal seal into documents he could barely comprehend. Court scribes worked by candlelight, drafting proclamations and amendments, while their sovereign drifted in and out of consciousness in the chamber above. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed it. England's most autocratic king had become dependent on others to execute his will, quite literally. But the will's contents revealed more than just succession planning. They exposed Henry's deepest fears about the future of his dynasty. Edward, his long-awaited male heir, remained a frail 9-year-old whose survival was far from guaranteed. Should the boy die without issue, the crown would pass to Mary, daughter of the divorced Catherine of Aragon, and a committed Catholic who had never accepted her father's religious reforms. After Mary came Elizabeth, the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, whose very legitimacy some questioned despite Henry's careful legal maneuvering. The king's paranoia about Catholic restoration had intensified during his final months, fueled by intelligence reports of foreign plots and domestic conspiracies. The Duke of Norfolk, England's premier Catholic nobleman, remained under sentence of death in the Tower of London, his execution delayed only by Henry's deteriorating condition and the complex political calculations of his potential successors. Norfolk's son, the Earl of Surrey, had already sealed his fate with reckless boasts about his family's royal blood and claims to the throne. How had Surrey, once one of England's most promising young nobles, managed to sign his own death warrant while his father languished in the Tower? The answer lay in the toxic atmosphere of suspicion that had consumed Henry's court during his final years. Surrey's poetic talents, which had once charmed the royal circle, now seemed evidence of dangerous ambition. His adoption of royal heraldry and casual references to his family's ancient lineage were interpreted as treasonous claims to the succession. In Henry's diseased imagination, every gesture of aristocratic pride became potential rebellion. The political implications of Surrey's fate sent shockwaves through the surviving nobility. If a man could be executed for the crime of noble blood and artistic pretension, what safety could any courtier expect? The traditional aristocracy, already weakened by decades of Henry's suspicious purges, found themselves increasingly marginalized by the rising Protestant faction that promised stability through reform rather than the chaos of continued Catholic intrigue. January brought with it a cascade of events that would seal England's religious future. On the 19th, Surrey's head fell beneath the executioner's axe at Tower Hill, his youth and talent sacrificed to his father's political miscalculations and his own fatal arrogance. The crowd that gathered to witness the execution was smaller than usual. London's citizens had grown weary of royal bloodshed, and the bitter winter weather kept all but the most committed spectators away. But Surrey's death served its intended purpose. It eliminated the most charismatic leader of the Catholic faction and left Norfolk isolated and powerless. The reprieve granted to Norfolk himself revealed the complex calculations driving Henry's final political moves. The Duke's execution had been scheduled, the warrant signed, the arrangements made. But as the king's condition worsened, practical considerations began to outweigh personal vengeance. Norfolk's death would have required Henry's active participation in the ceremony of royal justice, and the king could no longer maintain the pretense of vigorous leadership that such occasions demanded. More importantly, executing England's most senior peer on the eve of a regency would have created dangerous precedents about the limits of royal power. Instead, Norfolk remained in the Tower, a living reminder of the old order's vulnerability, while serving as a potential asset for whatever regime emerged after Henry's death. His survival would prove crucial in the coming power struggle, as various factions weighed the benefits of his experience against the risks of his religious convictions. The king's physicians, meanwhile, continued their elaborate charade of optimistic treatment while privately acknowledging the futility of their efforts. Recent cauterizations of his leg ulcers had produced temporary improvements that allowed Henry to participate in some court business. But these brief rallies only highlighted the severity of his overall decline. The mechanical hoists that moved his body had become as routine as the changing of the guard, their operation choreographed with military precision to maintain some semblance of royal dignity. But even as Henry's will secured the immediate succession, darker questions loomed about the long-term stability of Tudor rule. Could a 9-year-old king, governed by a council of ambitious nobles, maintain the religious and political unity that Henry had imposed through fear and force? The answer would depend on events already set in motion by the dying king's final strategic gamble, and time was running out faster than anyone dared to acknowledge. January 27th, 1547. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances across the presence chamber as Henry's breathing grows shallow and irregular, each labored breath potentially his last. By law, no physician could speak the truth that hung heavy in the winter air. Their king was hours from death, and the most dangerous moment in Tudor history was about to begin. The legal prohibition against predicting royal death had created a surreal atmosphere of enforced optimism that bordered on the grotesque. Sir Thomas Wendy, the king's principal physician, found himself trapped between medical reality and political survival. His years of training at Cambridge and Padua had taught him to recognize the unmistakable signs of approaching death: the rattling breath, the weakening pulse, the waxy pallor that no amount of rouge could disguise. Yet to voice these observations aloud would constitute treason of the highest order. The king's attendants had developed an elaborate code of meaningful glances and subtle gestures to communicate what words could not express. A raised eyebrow conveyed urgency. A barely perceptible nod indicated agreement about the gravity of the situation, while the positioning of hands and the tilt of heads spoke volumes about timing and preparation. This silent ballet of crisis management played out against the backdrop of Henry's increasingly erratic breathing, each pause between breaths stretching longer than the last. Sir Anthony Denny, gentleman of the Privy Chamber and one of the few men brave enough to speak directly to Henry about uncomfortable truths, found himself facing an impossible task. How does one approach the most autocratic king in English history, with the suggestion that he might benefit from last rites? The conversation, when it finally came, revealed both the complexity of Henry's religious position and the personal courage required to serve a dying tyrant. But what made Denny uniquely qualified for this delicate mission? His long years of intimate service to Henry had taught him to read the king's moods with uncanny precision. Unlike the physicians who approached their patient with clinical detachment, or the courtiers who maintained careful diplomatic distance, Denny had shared the king's most private moments. He had witnessed Henry's rages and reconciliations, his doubts, uncertainties, his human frailties beneath the imperial facade. The question of last rites carried implications far beyond spiritual comfort. Henry's break with Rome had created a theological minefield around the traditional Catholic ritual of extreme unction. As supreme head of the Church of England, the king had rejected papal authority while maintaining many Catholic ceremonies. His choice of clergy for final spiritual guidance would send powerful signals about the religious direction of his successor's reign. When Denny finally approached the royal bedside with his carefully phrased inquiry, Henry's response revealed the calculating intelligence that had survived even his body's devastating decline. The king chose Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the architect of English religious reform and a man whose Protestant sympathies were well known throughout Europe. But Henry's addendum, that he would sleep first, suggested either a final attempt to postpone the inevitable or a shrewd political calculation about timing. The hours that followed Denny's conversation with the king transformed Whitehall Palace into a pressure cooker of competing interests and barely contained ambitions. Word of Henry's condition spread through the court's informal networks with lightning speed. Despite official attempts to maintain secrecy, Edward Seymour's supporters quietly positioned themselves for rapid action, while conservative Catholics around the Duke of Norfolk, still imprisoned in the Tower, watched helplessly as their influence evaporated. The king's choice of Cranmer for last rites sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community. Foreign ambassadors, already filing urgent dispatches about the succession crisis, now had to recalibrate their assessments of England's future religious alignment. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and nephew of Henry's first wife Catherine of Aragon, had hoped for Catholic restoration under Princess Mary. Francis I of France saw opportunities for renewed alliance with whatever regime emerged from the coming chaos. Henry's physical condition during these final hours defied easy description. The combination of dropsy, infected ulcers, and probable heart failure had transformed him into something barely recognizable as the athletic prince who had once dominated European tournaments. Court attendants, trained in the elaborate protocols of royal service, found themselves improvising solutions to problems no manual of etiquette had anticipated. How does one maintain dignity for a sovereign whose body has become a battlefield of competing ailments? The stench emanating from the royal apartments had grown so overwhelming that aromatic herbs were burned continuously, their smoke creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to blur the boundaries between life and death. Servants working in shifts to manage the king's basic needs developed techniques for breathing through their mouths and positioning themselves to minimize exposure to the worst odors. These practical adaptations to an impossible situation revealed the human cost of serving absolute power in its most degraded form. Yet even as his body failed, Henry's political instincts remained sharp enough to recognize the significance of Cranmer's presence. The Archbishop's journey from Canterbury to Whitehall would take precious hours, time that could be used for final preparations, last-minute political adjustments, or simply the psychological preparation needed to face judgment before God. As night fell on January 27th, those keeping vigil in the royal apartments knew they were witnessing the end of an era. But none could predict whether Henry would survive until dawn, or how the carefully orchestrated transition of power would unfold once the king drew his final breath. The Lion of England lay dying, but his claws remained sharp enough to reshape the future even from his deathbed. 2 o'clock in the morning, Whitehall Palace. Archbishop Cranmer clasps the king's swollen hand as Henry VIII draws his final, rattling breath into the winter darkness. The death that would reshape 3 kingdoms had finally arrived, but the most dangerous phase of the Tudor succession crisis was only just beginning, because for the next 3 days, officially, the king would remain alive. Cranmer's midnight journey from Canterbury had been fraught with urgency and secrecy. The Archbishop, roused from sleep by royal messengers, understood that his summons carried implications far beyond spiritual comfort. As the architect of England's religious reformation and Henry's closest theological advisor, his presence at the deathbed would legitimize whatever final religious statements the king might make. The frozen roads between Canterbury and London had never seemed longer as his horse thundered through the darkness. When Cranmer finally reached the royal apartments, he found a scene that defied the elaborate protocols of Tudor court life. The presence chamber, normally a stage for royal magnificence, had been transformed into something resembling a medical theatre. Physicians huddled in whispered consultation, while attendants moved with the careful precision of men walking on thin ice. The king himself lay propped against silk pillows, his enormous bulk barely contained by the specially constructed bed frame that had become as much a part of royal furniture as the throne itself. The final spiritual exchange between Henry and Cranmer would be debated by Protestant and Catholic historians for centuries to come. Unable to speak, the dying king was asked to demonstrate his faith through physical gesture, a simple squeeze of the Archbishop's hand if he trusted in Christ's salvation rather than in ceremonial works. Contemporary accounts suggest Henry complied, though whether this represented genuine religious conviction or simply the reflexive response of a man slipping into unconsciousness remains a matter of theological interpretation. But why had Henry chosen this particular moment to make what appeared to be a final religious statement? The answer lay in the complex relationship between personal belief and political necessity that had defined his entire reign. Having broken with Rome over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Henry had spent decades walking a theological tightrope between Catholic tradition and Protestant innovation. His final gesture toward Reformed faith served multiple purposes. It provided comfort to Protestant supporters like Cranmer, while establishing a religious precedent for his son's future reign. The king's death, when it finally came, lacked the dramatic flourishes that popular imagination might expect. There were no final proclamations, no stirring speeches about England's destiny, no theatrical gestures of reconciliation or revenge. Instead, Henry VIII simply stopped breathing. his massive chest falling still as the candles flickered in the pre-dawn darkness. The most consequential death in Tudor history occurred with almost mundane quietness, witnessed by a small circle of physicians, clergy, and trusted servants who would carry the secret for 3 crucial days. Cranmer's immediate actions revealed both his spiritual authority and his political acumen. The Archbishop not only administered final spiritual comfort, but also served as the primary witness to Henry's peaceful death, a detail that would prove crucial in establishing the legitimacy of the succession. His presence ensured that no questions could be raised about the circumstances of the king's passing or the validity of his final religious expressions. The conspiracy of silence that followed Henry's death represented one of the most audacious political deceptions in English history. While the king's body lay cooling in his private chambers, meals continued to be delivered to the royal apartments with elaborate ceremony. Servants maintained their usual routines, guards kept their posts, and court life proceeded as if nothing had changed. The fiction that Henry remained alive and in reasonable health would be maintained until Edward Seymour could secure control of Prince Edward and the royal treasury. This 3-day deception required extraordinary coordination among dozens of participants, each of whom understood that discovery would mean certain death for treason. Kitchen staff prepared meals they knew would go uneaten. Guards saluted doorways they knew concealed a corpse, and courtiers continued their diplomatic conversations while knowing the man they served no longer drew breath. The psychological strain of maintaining such an elaborate lie while managing genuine grief and political anxiety pushed many participants to the breaking point. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death also revealed the practical challenges of managing royal mortality in an age of limited medical knowledge. The king's enormous size and the infections that had ravaged his body created unique preservation problems that court officials had never anticipated. Embalming techniques that worked for ordinary nobles proved inadequate for Henry's massive frame and compromised tissue. The race against decomposition became as urgent as the political maneuvering for control of the succession. Meanwhile, Edward Seymour moved with ruthless efficiency to consolidate power during the crucial window of official secrecy. His supporters quietly secured key positions throughout Whitehall, while potential rivals remained unaware that the balance of power had already shifted decisively. The Protestant faction's years of careful preparation were about to pay dividends that would reshape English religion and politics for generations. But as dawn broke over London on January 28th, none of the conspirators could predict how long their desperate deception would hold, or whether England would accept the radical changes they planned to implement in a 9-year-old king's name. Kitchen servants carry steaming platters through Whitehall's corridors to the king's chambers, their footsteps echoing with practiced normalcy, while Henry's corpse lies rotting behind closed doors. The most audacious political conspiracy in Tudor history had begun. 3 days to steal a kingdom, while pretending their sovereign still drew breath. Edward Seymour understood that controlling information meant controlling power. As Earl of Hertford and uncle to 9-year-old Prince Edward, he possessed both the motivation and the strategic position to exploit the window of secrecy surrounding Henry's death. But his success would depend on maintaining an impossible fiction, that the most closely watched man in England remained alive and governing, while his supporters quietly dismantled the political order he had left behind. The logistics of this deception required unprecedented coordination among dozens of conspirators. Palace guards continued their ceremonial duties, saluting doorways that concealed death rather than majesty. Kitchen staff prepared elaborate meals according to Henry's supposed dietary requirements, their preparations carried out with the same meticulous attention to royal preference that had characterized service to the living king. Laundresses collected soiled linens from the royal apartments, maintaining the fiction that normal bodily functions continued behind the heavily guarded doors. Court physicians found themselves playing perhaps the most crucial role in this macabre theatre. They continued their regular visits to the royal chambers, emerging with carefully composed expressions that suggested cautious optimism about their patient's condition. Their medical reports, dictated to secretaries who understood the deadly importance of each word, spoke of stabilization and gradual improvement. These documents, preserved in royal archives, would later serve as evidence of the conspiracy's breathtaking scope and sophisticated execution. But how did Seymour manage to coordinate such a complex operation while keeping his true intentions hidden from potential rivals? The answer lay in the fractured nature of Henry's court during his final months. The king's increasing isolation, driven by his physical condition and paranoid suspicions, had already limited the circle of those with regular access to his person. Seymour's position as the future king's uncle provided him with natural authority over security arrangements, while his Protestant allies controlled key administrative positions throughout the palace. The first crucial test of the conspiracy came within hours of Henry's death, when foreign ambassadors requested their usual audiences with the king. Diplomatic protocol demanded regular access to the monarch, particularly during periods of international tension. Seymour's solution revealed both his political sophistication and his willingness to take extraordinary risks. The audiences were granted, but conducted through intermediaries who claimed to be conveying the king's personal responses to questions and concerns. The Spanish ambassador, Charles V's representative at the English court, later wrote detailed dispatches describing his conversations with Henry during these final days. His reports, filled with specific royal responses to diplomatic inquiries, demonstrate how thoroughly the conspirators had prepared for this deception. Someone, likely Seymour himself, had studied Henry's typical responses to various diplomatic scenarios well enough to provide convincing royal reactions to current events. Meanwhile, the actual work of securing the succession proceeded with military precision. Prince Edward, residing at Hertford Castle under his uncle's protection, represented the most valuable political asset in England. Seymour's agents quietly reinforced the castle's defences while maintaining the appearance of routine security arrangements. Additional guards were positioned along the roads between Hertford and London, ostensibly to protect the prince from winter hazards, but actually to prevent any rival faction from seizing the future king. The royal treasury presented another critical target for Seymour's conspiracy. Henry's personal wealth, accumulated through the dissolution of monasteries and careful financial management, would provide whoever controlled it with enormous leverage in the coming power struggle. Treasury officials, many of whom owed their positions to Protestant patrons, cooperated in securing gold, silver, and important documents while maintaining normal administrative routines. But perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect of the deception involved the emotional toll on those who had genuinely served and respected Henry, despite his flaws. Palace servants who had attended the king for decades found themselves participating in an elaborate mockery of the man they had known intimately. The cognitive dissonance of maintaining loyal service to a corpse while plotting the future of his dynasty pushed many participants to the edge of emotional breakdown. The conspiracy's success also depended on managing the complex web of relationships that defined Tudor court life. Rivals had to be isolated without arousing suspicion, while potential allies needed careful cultivation. Conservative Catholics, already weakened by Surrey's execution and Norfolk's imprisonment, found themselves increasingly marginalized from decision-making processes they didn't yet realize had shifted decisively against them. As January 29th dawned, the conspirators had successfully maintained their fiction for over 24 hours. But each passing hour increased the risk of discovery, and the physical realities of death were becoming harder to disguise. Time was running out, and Edward Seymour knew that January 31st would bring either triumphant success or catastrophic failure, with no middle ground for England's future. January 31st. Church bells across London toll in solemn announcement as Edward Seymour returns from Hertford Castle, the keys to Henry's will clutched in his victorious hand. 3 days of unprecedented deception had succeeded beyond all expectations. England now belonged to a 9-year-old boy and the uncle who controlled him. The moment of revelation had been choreographed with theatrical precision. At precisely noon on January 31st, the Privy Council assembled in the Great Hall at Whitehall, their faces carefully composed to suggest surprise rather than conspiracy. Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley read the official announcement with the gravity befitting such momentous news. Henry VIII, by the grace of God, King of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and supreme head of the Church of England, had died peacefully in his sleep 3 days prior. The calculated delay in this announcement had allowed Seymour to complete the most audacious power grab in Tudor history. While London citizens went about their daily business, unaware that their monarch lay dead, the future Lord Protector had secured every advantage that careful planning and ruthless execution could provide. Prince Edward was safely under his uncle's control at Hertford Castle. The royal treasury had been secured by Protestant allies, and potential rivals found themselves isolated from the centers of power they had assumed would remain accessible. But the success of Seymour's conspiracy depended on one final, crucial detail. The keys to Henry's will had been deliberately separated from the document itself. This seemingly administrative precaution had created the perfect justification for the 3-day delay, as the will could not be officially opened and read until Seymour returned from his urgent mission to inform Prince Edward of his father's death. The theatrical timing was impeccable. Just as questions about the delay might have become uncomfortable, the grieving uncle appeared with the keys that would unlock England's future. The reading of Henry's will provided the legal foundation for everything that followed. The 16-man Regency Council that Henry had envisioned as a balanced coalition of competing interests was quickly revealed as a fiction. Seymour's supporters held the crucial positions, while his rivals found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered at every turn. The Protestant faction that had seemed merely influential under Henry now controlled the levers of government with overwhelming advantage. Young Edward's proclamation as king represented both constitutional continuity and revolutionary change. The traditional ceremonies proceeded exactly as protocol demanded. Heralds announced the new monarch's titles, courtiers pledged their loyalty, and foreign ambassadors prepared their congratulations. Yet beneath this facade of normal succession lay a fundamental shift in English governance. For the first time since the Norman conquest, effective power rested not with the crowned monarch but with a regency council dominated by religious reformers. How had Seymour managed to transform Henry's carefully balanced will into a Protestant manifesto without technically violating its terms? The answer lay in the ambiguous language of Tudor legal documents and the practical realities of governing through a child king. While Henry had named 16 executors to share power equally, he had not specified the mechanisms for resolving disputes or making urgent decisions. Seymour exploited these gaps with lawyerly precision, establishing precedents that would serve Protestant interests for years to come. The immediate aftermath of Edward's proclamation revealed the speed with which political allegiances could shift in Tudor England. Courtiers who had maintained careful neutrality during Henry's final months now scrambled to align themselves with the new regime. Conservative Catholics, already weakened by Surrey's execution and Norfolk's imprisonment, found themselves facing a stark choice. accommodation with Protestant reforms, or political exile from the centres of power. The Duke of Norfolk's fate exemplified the complex calculations facing Henry's former allies. Still imprisoned in the Tower of London, the Duke had expected his execution to proceed once the political transition was complete. Instead, he found himself in an unexpectedly advantageous position, alive when Surrey was dead, experienced when Seymour needed administrative expertise, and Catholic when the new regime sought to demonstrate its inclusiveness. His survival would prove one of the succession's most ironic outcomes. Foreign reactions to Edward's accession revealed the international implications of England's religious and political transformation. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and defender of Catholic orthodoxy, had hoped for Mary Tudor's eventual succession and Catholic restoration. Francis I of France saw opportunities for renewed alliance with a weakened England under Regency government. Both monarchs would need to recalibrate their diplomatic strategies to account for Protestant dominance in English policymaking. The logistical challenges of managing a child king while maintaining royal dignity required creative solutions to unprecedented problems. Edward's youth made traditional monarchy impossible. He could not lead armies, intimidate nobles, or command respect through physical presence as his father had done. Instead, the Regency government would need to develop new forms of authority based on institutional rather than personal power. As February began, England faced its greatest political transformation since the Norman conquest, but the most challenging test still lay ahead. Could a Protestant regency maintain stability while implementing radical religious reforms in the name of a boy king? The answer would determine whether Seymour's conspiracy had saved or doomed the Tudor dynasty. Embalmers recoil in horror as they slice open Henry's massive abdomen, releasing a torrent of putrid fluid that sends even hardened morticians stumbling toward windows for fresh air. The king's death had been politically managed with masterful precision, but his corpse presented challenges that no amount of Tudor ceremony could easily disguise. The embalming process began on January 31st, immediately after the official announcement of Henry's death. Royal morticians, summoned from across London for this unprecedented task, arrived at Whitehall expecting to apply their usual techniques to preserve the monarch for lying in state. What they discovered in the royal death chamber defied their professional experience and tested the limits of their strong stomachs. Henry's enormous bulk, ravaged by years of infection and disease, had begun decomposing with alarming rapidity. The removal of internal organs, standard practice in royal embalming, revealed the full extent of Henry's medical catastrophes. His liver, enlarged and diseased, bore the unmistakable signs of chronic alcoholism and metabolic disorder. His heart, grotesquely swollen, provided evidence of the cardiovascular failure that had ultimately claimed his life. Most shocking were his intestines, riddled with infections that had clearly been spreading throughout his body during his final months. The embalmers, professional men accustomed to death in all its forms, later reported that they had never encountered internal organs in such an advanced state of disease. The practical challenges of preserving Henry's corpse required innovations in mortuary science that pushed Tudor techniques to their limits. Traditional methods of cavity preparation, designed for normal-sized bodies, proved inadequate for the king's massive frame. Additional sawdust, spices, and preservatives had to be imported from across London, while the embalming process itself required twice the usual time and 3 times the normal workforce. The aromatic herbs used to mask decomposition odors were burned in such quantities that Whitehall Palace resembled an enormous incense burner. But why had Henry's body begun decomposing so rapidly, even by the standards of Tudor England? The answer lay in the combination of his extreme obesity, chronic infections, and the winter conditions that made proper preservation extraordinarily difficult. The ulcers that had plagued his final years had created ideal conditions for bacterial growth, while his enormous size made it impossible to maintain consistent temperature control throughout the corpse. The embalmers found themselves racing against biological processes that seemed determined to rob the king of dignity, even in death. The construction of Henry's coffin presented its own unique challenges that revealed the extraordinary physical reality of his final years. Royal carpenters, working from measurements that seemed almost impossible to believe, crafted a lead-lined casket that measured nearly twice the width of a standard noble's final resting place. The weight of this massive container, even before Henry's body was placed inside, required reinforced supports and additional bearers for transport. Court records document payments to blacksmiths for strengthening the wheeled platform that would carry the coffin, while additional horses were requisitioned for the funeral procession. The lying in state at Whitehall provided England's nobility with their first opportunity to pay respects to their deceased monarch, but also created new problems for those managing the king's remains. Despite the embalmer's best efforts, odors continued to emanate from the sealed coffin, requiring continuous burning of aromatics and careful positioning of mourners to minimize exposure. The elaborate wax hearse constructed for the occasion consumed over a ton of materials, its ornate decorations serving practical as well as ceremonial purposes by helping to mask the reality of decomposition beneath. The funeral preparations, overseen by the College of Arms with typical Tudor attention to precedent and protocol, required adaptations that revealed the unique challenges of burying such an enormous monarch. Traditional funeral processions were designed around coffins that could be carried by 6 or 8 bearers, but Henry's remains required a wheeled platform drawn by teams of horses. The route from Whitehall to Windsor Castle, normally covered in a single day, would need to be extended to accommodate the slower pace necessitated by the massive funeral cortege. Court officials planning the procession faced a delicate balance between royal dignity and practical necessity. The coffin's size made it impossible to transport through some of the narrower London streets traditionally used for royal funeral processions, requiring alternative routes that could accommodate the unprecedented dimensions of Henry's final journey. Additional guards were posted along the entire route, ostensibly for ceremonial purposes, but actually to maintain order should the macabre realities of the king's condition become apparent to spectators. The overnight stop at Sion Abbey, a traditional way station for royal funeral processions, would provide the most dramatic evidence of the embalmer's losing battle against decomposition. As the massive coffin rested in the Abbey church, the lead lining that was supposed to contain the king's remains began to buckle under internal pressure from gases building within the decomposing body. Contemporary accounts, recorded with typical Tudor attention to ominous signs and portents, describe the horrifying moment when the coffin actually split, leaking putrid fluids onto the sacred floor. Legend would later embellish this incident with the detail that stray dogs licked at the seepage, creating a grotesque final indignity for a king who had spent his reign obsessed with majesty and control. Whether this particular detail reflected actual events or symbolic interpretation, it captured the essential horror of Henry's final journey. The man who had commanded absolute obedience from his subjects could not command respect from his own decaying flesh. As the funeral procession prepared to complete its journey to Windsor Castle, those responsible for managing Henry's remains faced an uncomfortable truth. Even in death, the king continued to present challenges that defied conventional solutions. February 16th, St. George's Chapel. Henry's massive coffin descends into the vault beside Jane Seymour, as England buries not just a king, but an entire era of absolute monarchy. The funeral that laid Henry VIII to rest would mark the last time Tudor England would witness such a spectacle of royal power, even as that power was already dissolving into the hands of Protestant reformers who understood that the future belonged to institutions, not individuals. The funeral procession that departed London on February 14th represented the most elaborate display of royal magnificence in Tudor history, yet it served primarily to conceal the grotesque reality of Henry's decomposing remains. Over 1,000 mounted mourners followed the massive coffin wagon through streets lined with subjects who had lived their entire lives under Henry's rule. Black-draped horses strained against the unprecedented weight, their breath forming clouds in the winter air as they pulled their monstrous burden toward Windsor Castle. The 4-mile funeral train stretched beyond the horizon, a river of black-clad humanity that seemed to encompass all of England's nobility and clergy. Heralds bearing the ceremonial weapons of kingship rode alongside bishops carrying sacred relics, while representatives of every major guild and corporation in London added their numbers to the procession. This carefully orchestrated display of national mourning served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the continuity of royal authority, provided legitimacy for Edward VI's succession, and created a spectacle magnificent enough to overshadow any unseemly details about the corpse at its center. But the true significance of Henry's funeral lay not in its pageantry, but in what it represented about the transformation of English governance. The man being buried had ruled through personal charisma, physical intimidation, and the constant threat of violence. His successor, a 9-year-old boy, would govern through parliamentary acts, council decisions, and institutional authority. The elaborate funeral ceremonies that honored Henry's memory were simultaneously celebrating the end of the medieval monarchy he had embodied. The interment at St. George's Chapel provided a final irony that would have delighted Henry's sense of dramatic timing. His placement beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a male heir, and the only one who had escaped his murderous affections by dying in childbirth, created a posthumous domestic harmony that had eluded him throughout his turbulent reign. The symbolism was not lost on contemporary observers. Henry's final rest came not with the queens he had executed or divorced, but with the one woman who had fulfilled his dynastic dreams without triggering his paranoid rage. The abandoned plans for Henry's tomb reveal perhaps the most telling aspect of his legacy. The massive bronze monument he had commissioned, designed to dwarf every other royal burial site in England, remained unfinished due to financial constraints and shifting political priorities. The 40 life-sized figures and towering equestrian statue that were meant to proclaim his eternal glory were never cast, leaving only architectural drawings as evidence of his grandiose vision. Instead, Henry's grave was marked by a simple stone slab installed in 1837, its modest inscription a stark contrast to the imperial ambitions that had defined his reign. How did England's most image-conscious monarch end up with such a humble memorial? The answer lay in the speed with which political realities changed after his death. Edward Seymour's Protestant government had little interest in perpetuating the cult of personality that had surrounded Henry, preferring to establish new forms of authority based on religious reform rather than royal mystique. The bronze intended for Henry's monument was eventually melted down during the English Civil War, a development that would have infuriated the king, who had spent his life crafting his public image. The vault's reopening in 1813, necessitated by preparations for Charles I's burial, provided a macabre epilogue to Henry's story. Observers reported finding the lead coffin crushed under its own weight, with the king's bones visible through the damaged casing. This final indignity, visited upon Henry's remains more than 2 centuries after his death, seemed to complete the process of physical dissolution that had begun during his final illness. Modern medical analysis of Henry's symptoms has provided insights that would have fascinated the king himself, given his lifelong obsession with his own health. The combination of type 2 diabetes, chronic osteomyelitis, and probable Cushing's syndrome that likely killed him represents a medical case study in the dangers of absolute power combined with unlimited appetite. His transformation from athletic prince to morbidly obese tyrant serves as a powerful metaphor for how unchecked authority can corrupt not just politically, but physically. The religious implications of Henry's death proved even more significant than the political ones. His break with Rome had been driven by personal necessity rather than theological conviction, leaving England's religious settlement in a state of creative ambiguity that his successors would need to resolve. Edward VI's Protestant reforms, Mary I's Catholic restoration, and Elizabeth VI's Anglican compromise all claimed legitimacy from Henry's precedent, demonstrating how his complex religious legacy could be interpreted to support radically different policies. Perhaps most remarkably, Henry's death marked the beginning of England's transformation from a peripheral European kingdom into a future global empire. The institutional structures that emerged from his reign, a strengthened parliament, a professional navy, a centralized bureaucracy, would provide the foundation for England's eventual dominance of world trade and colonial expansion. The king who had spent his reign looking backward to medieval models of kingship had inadvertently created the governmental framework for England's modern future. As the last shovelful of earth covered Henry's grave at Windsor, England began its journey toward a form of constitutional monarchy that would have been incomprehensible to the man buried beneath. The absolute power he had wielded so ruthlessly died with him, replaced by more collaborative forms of governance that would prove far more durable than any individual monarch. The Lion of England was finally at rest, but the kingdom he left behind would roar louder than he had ever imagined.